Introduction and background. SkyConnect Airlines Flight 721 was more than just a commercial flight, it was a symbol of the bustling global connectivity that defined modern aviation. On June 16, 2023, this routine trans-Pacific route from Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, to Tokyo Narita Airport, NRT, promised a seamless 10-hour journey across the serene skies above the Pacific Ocean. It was an ordinary day at LAX, with the airport alive with the rhythms of departures and arrivals. Yet, for the 287 passengers and 16 crew members boarding Flight 721, this day would become an indelible mark in aviation history, a day marked by tragedy. The Boeing 747-8, designated for Flight 721, stood majestically on the tarmac as passengers boarded. This aircraft, nicknamed Pacific Star, was a stalwart of SkyConnect's fleet. Introduced in 2015, it had completed nearly 20,000 flight cycles, consistently meeting stringent safety standards. With its advanced avionics, fuel efficiency, and impeccable track record, the Boeing 747-8 was the pride of the airline. Passengers gazed in awe at the colossal plane, its 4 Pratt & Whitney engines poised for the journey ahead. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Moore prepared for takeoff. With over 25 years of experience, Moore was one of the airline's most decorated pilots, having logged more than 15,000 hours in the air. Known for his calm demeanor and precision under pressure, he was a trusted leader in SkyConnect's operations. His co-pilot, First Officer Karen Lynn, was an equally competent professional. At just 34 years old, Lynn had earned a reputation for her sharp analytical skills and quick thinking. Together, they made a formidable team, supported by relief pilot David Ramirez, who was on board to assist during the long-haul flight. The cabin crew, led by purser Samantha Collins, consisted of seasoned professionals dedicated to providing top-tier service. Collins, with her 18 years of experience, was the embodiment of grace under pressure. Alongside her were flight attendants Lisa Martinez, Peter Jensen, and 5 others, all trained rigorously in both hospitality and emergency response. Passengers filled the aircraft's cabins, representing a microcosm of global society. In first class, Jonathan Price, a tech entrepreneur, prepared for a critical meeting with Japanese investors. Across the aisle, retired Professor Margaret Harris settled into her seat, her well-worn travel journal open on her lap. In economy class, the Turner family, parents Susan and Mark with their twin sons, chatted excitedly about their reunion with relatives in Tokyo. Among the passengers was also Elena Carter, a leading environmental scientist, traveling to deliver a keynote address at a global summit. These were just a few of the stories among the hundreds on board, each passenger with their unique destination, dreams, and reasons for travel. The mood on board was one of anticipation and calm. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, assisting passengers with luggage, demonstrating safety procedures, and distributing refreshments. Outside, the warm Californian sun bathed the tarmac as Flight 721 received clearance for departure. The engines roared to life, their thunderous power reverberating through the cabin as the plane taxied to the runway. As the Boeing 747 took off, its ascent was flawless, the sheer power of its engines propelling it effortlessly into the azure sky. Inside, passengers marveled at the sights below, the sprawling city of Los Angeles growing smaller with each passing second. The Pacific stretched ahead, promising a journey of beauty and tranquility. For many, this flight was routine, yet others saw it as the beginning of something new, a family reunion, a business opportunity, or an adventure abroad. In the cockpit, the pilots began to settle into the rhythm of long-haul aviation. Captain Moore engaged autopilot as the plane reached its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. First Officer Lynn meticulously reviewed the flight plan, ensuring alignment with air traffic control directives. They discussed expected weather patterns, noting a patch of turbulence near the mid-Pacific waypoint but otherwise calm skies. The crew shared light banter, a testament to their confidence in their skills and the aircraft. Meanwhile, in the cabin, life unfolded in quiet moments of comfort. Jonathan Price typed furiously on his laptop, preparing a presentation. The Turner twins giggled as they watched a cartoon on their screens. Dr. Carter flipped through her notes, rehearsing her upcoming speech. Flight attendants distributed meals, moving seamlessly between aisles with practiced ease. The hum of the engines provided a backdrop to these moments of normalcy, lulling some passengers into peaceful sleep. Unbeknownst to anyone aboard, a ticking time bomb lay hidden within one of the aircraft's seemingly flawless engines. During its last maintenance check, a hairline fracture in the No. 2 engine's turbine blade had gone unnoticed. This tiny imperfection, caused by metal fatigue, would soon grow into a catastrophic failure. For now, however, the Pacific Star soared confidently, an engineering marvel defying gravity and carrying its occupants toward their destinations. At Los Angeles International Airport, ground crews watched Flight 721 fade into the horizon, another successful departure logged in their books. Yet, the plane's routine ascent marked the beginning of a series of events that would unfold with devastating consequences. Thousands of miles away in Tokyo, families and colleagues eagerly awaited their loved one's arrival, unaware that fate had already begun to conspire against this ill-fated flight. As Flight 721 continued its journey across the Pacific, the stage was set for a calamity that would leave an indelible scar on aviation history. The passengers and crew, oblivious to the impending disaster, carried on with their lives in the confines of the aircraft. Each moment of calm now felt like the stillness before a storm, a fragile piece poised to shatter in ways unimaginable. The flight and initial problems. SkyConnect Airlines Flight 721 cruised steadily at an altitude of 35,000 feet, slicing through the serene skies above the Pacific Ocean. For the passengers and crew, the flight seemed to be progressing as planned. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Moore and First Officer Karen Lynn monitored the controls, making minor adjustments to maintain the optimal trajectory. The autopilot system was engaged, giving the pilots time to review weather patterns, coordinate with air traffic control, and relax into the routine of a long-haul flight. Relief pilot David Ramirez reclined in the observer seat, flipping through a novel while remaining alert for any unforeseen developments. 2 hours into the journey, as the aircraft approached its first oceanic waypoint, a sudden vibration coursed through the fuselage. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable to passengers engrossed in their movies or meals. In the cockpit, however, the vibration triggered an immediate reaction. Captain Moore instinctively glanced at the engine instruments displayed on the primary flight display. "Do you feel that?" Lynn asked, her hand already reaching for the overhead controls. Before Moore could respond, a sharp, metallic groan echoed through the cabin, followed by a jarring thud. Passengers gasped, some instinctively gripping their armrests. Overhead bins rattled, and several oxygen masks dropped momentarily before retracting. In the cockpit, alarms blared as the master caution light illuminated, accompanied by a warning on the engine display, "Engine failure, English 2." "Engine 2 just failed," Moore said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Karen, run the engine failure checklist." "David, get on the comms with ATC and declare an emergency." Lynn's fingers flew across the overhead panel as she initiated the engine shutdown procedure. Moore, meanwhile, disengaged autopilot and took manual control of the aircraft, adjusting the thrust on the remaining 3 engines to stabilize their altitude. Back in the cabin, confusion and anxiety spread rapidly among the passengers. Flight attendants moved quickly to reassure them, their training kicking in despite their own fears. Samantha Collins, the purser, grabbed the intercom and spoke in a calm, practiced tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor technical issue. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The crew is addressing the situation. Her words had the intended effect on most, but some passengers whispered nervously, their imaginations racing. The Turner twins, sensing their parents' unease, clung to them in silence. Jonathan Price glanced out the window, noticing an eerie flicker of flame from the left wing before it abruptly vanished. In the cockpit, Lynn completed the engine shutdown checklist, but a new problem had emerged. Debris from the engine failure had ruptured hydraulic lines running through the left wing. These lines controlled critical systems, including the flaps and rudder, which were essential for maneuvering the aircraft. "Hydraulics are compromised," Lynn reported, her voice tight with urgency. "We've lost control of the left wing's flaps and rudder." "All right, let's assess," Moore said, gripping the control column tightly. "Karen, pull up the QRH for multiple hydraulic failures." "David, request vectors to the nearest alternate airport." Ramirez nodded and relayed their situation to air traffic control. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." SkyConnect 721 declaring an emergency. "We've experienced an engine failure and hydraulic system loss. Requesting immediate vectors to the nearest airport capable of handling a 747. The response was immediate. Controllers at Oakland Center began coordinating with Pacific ATC to identify viable options. The closest airfield with a suitable runway was Honolulu International Airport, located nearly 1,200 miles away. However, the damage to the hydraulic systems and the increasing instability of the aircraft posed serious challenges. As Moore struggled to maintain control, the aircraft began to exhibit alarming behavior. The loss of hydraulic pressure caused uneven lift across the wings, forcing the plane into a gradual leftward roll. Moore countered with careful adjustments to the throttles, but it became clear that they were fighting a losing battle against physics. In the cabin, passengers became increasingly aware of the severity of the situation. The aircraft's slight banking motion was now more pronounced, and the intermittent flickering of lights added to the growing sense of dread. A child's wail broke the tense silence, prompting a ripple of murmured reassurances from nearby passengers. Collins and her team sprang into action, securing loose items and preparing for the possibility of an emergency landing. Despite their efforts to maintain composure, the fear in their eyes did not go unnoticed. "Are we going to crash?" a nervous voice asked Collins as she moved through the cabin. "No, we're in good hands," Collins replied firmly, forcing a smile. "The pilots are trained for situations like this." In the cockpit, the situation grew more dire. The Boeing 747 was now operating on 3 engines and compromised hydraulics, and the strain on its systems was becoming evident. The aircraft's nose pitched up slightly as the remaining engines struggled to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. "We're losing speed," Lynn said, her voice edged with concern. "We need to start descending, or we risk stalling." Moore nodded, his mind racing. "All right, let's start a controlled descent. Karen, inform ATC and request priority clearance into Honolulu. David, calculate our fuel consumption. We need to make sure we've got enough to get there." Lynn relayed the new plan to air traffic control, who cleared them for an emergency approach to Honolulu. However, the descent added another layer of complexity. The aircraft's compromised control surfaces made it difficult to manage the angle of descent, and every adjustment required painstaking precision. As the Pacific stretched endlessly below, the gravity of their predicament weighed heavily on everyone aboard. For Moore, every decision carried the weight of 303 lives, each dependent on his skill and resolve. In the passenger cabin, the once vibrant atmosphere had turned somber. Dr. Carter closed her eyes, clutching her notes as if they could anchor her in the storm of uncertainty. The Turner family huddled together, whispering reassurances they didn't fully believe. Minutes felt like hours as the aircraft crept closer to its alternate destination. Honolulu ATC prepared for the emergency landing, mobilizing fire and rescue teams in anticipation. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Moore and Lynn worked tirelessly to keep the aircraft stable. "We've got this," Moore said quietly, though the strain in his voice betrayed his fear. "We just need to hold on a little longer." But fate had other plans. As the Boeing 747 approached 10,000 feet, a violent shudder tore through the airframe. The loss of hydraulic pressure had caused a critical structural failure in the left wing, sending the aircraft into an uncontrolled roll. "Brace for impact," Moore shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony of alarms. In the cabin, Collins and her team shouted commands, urging passengers to assume the brace position. Chaos erupted as the aircraft pitched and rolled, the once calm cabin now a scene of pure terror. Screams filled the air, mingling with the deafening roar of the engines and the ominous creak of the failing airframe. As the Pacific Ocean rushed up to meet them, Flight 721 hurtled toward its tragic fate, the culmination of a series of failures that no one aboard could have foreseen. The crash and immediate aftermath. Flight 721 hurtled toward the ocean, the Boeing 747's once mighty frame succumbing to the forces of gravity and aerodynamic failure. Inside, the cabin was a cacophony of terror. Passengers screamed, cried, and clung to one another as the aircraft spiraled downward. The flight attendants, though gripped by fear themselves, shouted commands over the chaos. Brace! Brace! Heads down! Stay down! Samantha Collins yelled, her voice cutting through the din. Her hands trembled as she strapped herself into her jump seat, her years of training fighting against the primal fear gripping her. In the cockpit, Captain Moore and First Officer Lynn worked frantically to regain control of the aircraft. Every adjustment to the throttles and control surfaces yielded minimal response. The Boeing 747, its left wing severely compromised, resisted every effort to level out. Red warning lights flashed across the instrument panel, accompanied by a chorus of alarms. Too fast, Lynn said, her voice tight as she wrestled with the yoke. We're losing vertical stability. Moore gritted his teeth, his knuckles white on the controls. Come on, hold together, he muttered, as if willing the aircraft to respond. But the damage was too extensive. The hydraulic systems were almost entirely drained, and the airframe groaned under the immense stress of the uncontrolled descent. Impact in 60 seconds, Ramirez reported, his voice trembling as he monitored the altimeter. The ocean's dark expanse loomed larger with every passing moment. Mayday, 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 Moore shouted into the radio, his voice cracking for the first time. This is SkyConnect 721. We are going down, attempting a controlled water landing. Coordinates, his words trailed off as the aircraft jolted violently, the altimeter spinning rapidly downward. Back in the cabin, passengers held their loved ones tightly. Some whispered prayers, others screamed for help that could not come. Dr. Carter clutched her briefcase, her mind racing through fragmented thoughts of her life's work and the family she would never see again. The Turner family huddled together, the parents shielding their children as best they could. As the Boeing 747 neared the surface, Moore issued one final command, brace for impact. The aircraft struck the water at a shallow angle, its nose slicing through the ocean's surface with a deafening crash. The impact was catastrophic. The front section of the fuselage crumpled under the force, instantly killing those in the cockpit and the forward cabin. The middle section broke apart, flinging debris and passengers into the water. The tail section, remarkably intact, sank quickly as water rushed in. For those who survived the initial impact, the nightmare was far from over. The freezing Pacific waters, illuminated only by the dim light of the moon, swallowed the remnants of the aircraft. Screams and cries for help echoed across the waves, mingling with the hiss of escaping air and the creak of sinking debris. Samantha Collins, dazed and injured, unbuckled herself from her jump seat. Pain shot through her legs, but adrenaline drove her forward. She grabbed a life vest and helped passengers still alive in her section, urging them to evacuate onto floating debris. Hold on to something. Don't panic, she shouted, her voice hoarse. She pulled a young girl from the wreckage, securing her onto a piece of floating fuselage. Around her, others clung to whatever they could find, seat cushions, life vests, and shattered pieces of the plane. Jonathan Price, blood streaming down his face, clung to a piece of wing, coughing violently as he struggled to stay afloat. Nearby, Elena Carter surfaced, gasping for air as she grabbed onto the remains of an emergency slide. She scanned the water, searching for other survivors. Over here, a voice shouted in the darkness. It was David Ramirez, the relief pilot, who had managed to escape the sinking cockpit section. He swam toward a cluster of survivors, helping them onto a makeshift raft formed from floating debris. The minutes after the crash were chaotic and harrowing. Survivors battled hypothermia, injuries, and the psychological shock of what had just occurred. The debris field stretched for miles, and in the darkness, many were separated from the larger groups. Rescue operations were initiated within minutes of the crash, but the remote location delayed their arrival. The U.S. Coast Guard, along with nearby commercial vessels, raced to the coordinates transmitted by the plane's emergency beacon. Helicopters with powerful searchlights scanned the ocean, illuminating the scattered wreckage. After nearly 2 hours, the first rescue teams arrived on the scene. Boats pulled survivors from the frigid water, some barely clinging to life. Samantha Collins was among the first to be rescued, her body shivering uncontrollably as she clung to a child she had saved. Jonathan Price was hauled aboard another vessel, his face pale and his body shaking from the cold. Not everyone was so fortunate. Dozens of bodies floated in the water, their lifeless forms a haunting reminder of the crash's devastation. Among the dead was Elena Carter, who had succumbed to her injuries and hypothermia while clinging to a piece of debris. The Turner family was never found, their fate sealed in the sinking fuselage. As dawn broke, the full scale of the disaster became clear. Rescue teams recovered 112 survivors from the crash, many of them suffering from severe injuries and shock. The remaining 191 passengers and crew perished, making it the deadliest aviation disaster in over 3 decades. The wreckage, scattered across a vast expanse of ocean, would take weeks to recover fully. Black box recorders, crucial for understanding the crash's final moments, were located 48 hours later by a deep-sea recovery team. Their discovery marked the beginning of a long and painstaking investigation into the causes of the tragedy. For those who survived, the ordeal was far from over. They would carry the physical and emotional scars of the crash for the rest of their lives. Families of the victims began to gather at SkyConnect's headquarters, demanding answers and mourning the loss of their loved ones. Flight 721's crash site became a temporary graveyard in the vast Pacific, a haunting reminder of the fragility of human endeavors. As the last pieces of wreckage were retrieved, the world turned its attention to the investigators tasked with uncovering the truth behind the tragedy. Investigation and legacy. The crash of SkyConnect Airlines Flight 721 triggered one of the most comprehensive aviation investigations in history. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, in collaboration with international aviation authorities, launched an immediate inquiry into the disaster. With 191 lives lost, including all 3 pilots, the incident demanded a detailed examination of the factors that had led to the worst air crash in over 3 decades. Within days, the flight data recorder, FDR, and cockpit voice recorder, CVR, commonly referred to as the black boxes, were recovered from the Pacific Ocean. These devices held critical information about the aircraft's final moments, offering investigators their first glimpse into the sequence of events. Salvage teams also began recovering significant portions of the wreckage, piecing together the shattered remains of the Boeing 747 to reconstruct the disaster. The initial findings from the black boxes revealed a catastrophic failure in the number 2 engine roughly 2 hours into the flight. The CVR captured the moment of failure, the sudden vibration, and the alarms that followed. Captain Daniel Moore's calm voice could be heard coordinating with First Officer Karen Lynn as they struggled to stabilize the aircraft. The data confirmed that shrapnel from the engine failure had punctured hydraulic lines, crippling critical flight control systems. Further analysis traced the engine failure to a hairline crack in one of the turbine blades. Metallurgical experts determined that the crack had been caused by fatigue, a gradual weakening of the metal over time. The defect, though microscopic, had grown unnoticed during routine inspections, ultimately resulting in the catastrophic breakup of the engine mid-flight. The investigation also examined the hydraulic system's vulnerability. SkyConnect's Boeing 747-8 fleet had a triple-redundant hydraulic system designed to withstand significant damage. However, the engine debris had severed lines in such a way that all three systems were compromised, leaving the pilots with severely limited control. The NTSB concluded that this rare and highly improbable combination of failures had left the crew with virtually no chance of recovery. As the investigation unfolded, attention turned to SkyConnect Airlines' maintenance practices. Records showed that the failed engine had undergone routine inspections, but the microscopic crack had eluded detection. Critics questioned whether the airline's inspection protocols were adequate and whether more advanced diagnostic tools could have prevented the disaster. The airline faced intense scrutiny from both the media and regulatory bodies. Families of the victims filed lawsuits, accusing SkyConnect of negligence and demanding accountability. Public confidence in the airline plummeted, and ticket sales dropped sharply. In response, SkyConnect's CEO held a press conference, pledging full cooperation with investigators and committing to sweeping changes in maintenance procedures. The disaster also spurred industry-wide changes. The NTSB issued a series of safety recommendations to manufacturers, airlines, and regulators. Among them was a call for more stringent inspection protocols for turbine blades, including the use of advanced imaging technologies capable of detecting microscopic flaws. Additionally, the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, mandated modifications to hydraulic system designs to make them more resilient against debris damage. The legacy of Flight 721 extended beyond technical improvements. Survivors and families of the victims became vocal advocates for aviation safety, ensuring that the lessons of the tragedy would not be forgotten. Memorial services were held across the world, honoring the lives lost and acknowledging the bravery of those who had fought to save the aircraft. For many survivors, the crash left deep emotional scars. Samantha Collins, the purser who had saved several lives in the aftermath, became a symbol of resilience. Despite her physical injuries and lingering trauma, she spoke publicly about the importance of emergency preparedness and passenger safety. "We cannot undo what happened," she said during a televised interview, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "But we can ensure that the lessons we've learned save lives in the future." Among the victims, stories of heroism and heartbreak emerged. Captain Moore and First Officer Lynn were posthumously awarded for their actions during the crisis. Investigators determined that their efforts had slowed the aircraft's descent enough to allow many passengers to survive the initial impact. Families of the crew members mourned their loss but took solace in the knowledge that their loved ones had acted with courage and professionalism to the very end. The crash site itself became a somber reminder of the fragility of human innovation. A memorial buoy was placed at the coordinates where the aircraft went down, bearing the names of the 191 victims. Every year, on the anniversary of the crash, families and survivors gathered to honor their memory, casting flowers into the ocean as a gesture of remembrance. For the aviation industry, the tragedy of Flight 721 served as a wake-up call. It highlighted vulnerabilities in even the most advanced systems, emphasizing the need for constant vigilance and innovation. SkyConnect Airlines, though battered by lawsuits and public distrust, emerged from the crisis with a renewed commitment to safety. The airline overhauled its maintenance division, adopted cutting-edge inspection technologies, and established a safety advisory board to prevent future incidents. In the years following the crash, aviation experts hailed the reforms inspired by Flight 721 as a turning point in the industry. Accident rates, already at historic lows, declined even further as new technologies and protocols took effect. The lessons learned from the disaster became case studies in pilot training programs and engineering schools, ensuring that future generations would benefit from the knowledge gained through tragedy. For the survivors and the families of those who perished, life after Flight 721 was a journey of healing. Some found solace in activism, working to improve airline safety standards. Others channeled their grief into creating scholarships and charities in honor of their loved ones. The pain of the loss never fully disappeared, but it became a catalyst for positive change, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The story of Flight 721 remains a sobering reminder of the risks inherent in air travel and the responsibility borne by those who design, maintain, and operate these marvels of engineering. It is a story of tragedy and loss, but also of courage, resilience, and the enduring pursuit of safety. In the vast skies where Flight 721 met its end, the lessons it taught continue to guide aviation toward a safer future.